I've learned that the sharpest knife isn't made of steel. It's betrayal. And when it comes from blood, it doesn't cut your skin, it carves your soul. Before I go any further, if you find yourself gripped by my story, I want you to stay with me. Share it. Comment what you feel, because every scar I'm about to uncover deserves to be remembered. My voice has been buried in silence for years, but tonight, it rises. It started on a night. So ordinary it should have been forgettable. September in North Carolina, when the air is thick with the last whispers of summer and the first chill of fall. The Miller family house stood like a photograph from some faded catalog. White walls, green shutters, a porch where my father always sat polishing his bourbon glass, as if it held more truth than his children ever could. I parked my car down the gravel driveway, the headlights slicing across the fields. My brother Daniel's truck was already there, glinting under the porch light. That sight alone sent a tremor through me. We hadn't spoken in weeks, not since the argument about the business. He had my father's ear, I had a suspicion. When I stepped inside, the familiar smell of roasted chicken and old wood hit me. The house felt the same but colder. My mother greeted me with her usual tender smile, but even in her eyes, I caught the flicker of unease. "Ethan," she said softly, kissing my cheek. Her touch was warm, but her gaze darted quickly to the living room, where voices rose in sharp tones. I followed the sound and found my father in his recliner, Daniel standing beside him like a soldier guarding a general. They stopped talking when they saw me. My father's lips curled in that half-smile I had grown to despise. It never meant kindness. It meant calculation. "Nice of you to join us," he said, swirling the bourbon. "Your brother was just explaining why the company needs a stronger hand at the wheel." I clenched my jaw. "Our company," I reminded him, "not his." Daniel smirked, the same smirk that used to flash across his face when we were kids and he'd stolen something of mine. "Dad knows I'm better at making the tough calls," he said. "You're too soft, too emotional." My fist tightened. For months I had been working 18-hour days, keeping Miller Construction afloat. I had secured contracts, balanced debts, kept men paid when the books said they shouldn't have been. And yet here was my brother, swooping in with charm and half-truths, poising my father's mind against me. "Is that true?" I asked my father. My voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the weight of every year I had tried to earn his approval. He didn't answer. He just raised his glass, took a long sip, and let silence be the executioner. Something broke inside me that night. Dinner was a blur of half-hearted conversation. My mother tried to stitch the family together with small talk about church fundraisers and neighborhood gossip, but the rift between us widened with every bite. Daniel spoke confidently, leaning closer to our father, whispering ideas, plans, promises. I watched the torch of inheritance pass right in front of me. When I left the table, I went out to the porch to breathe. The crickets screamed in the fields, mocking my silence. That's when I heard them. My father and Daniel in the living room, voices carrying to the screen door. "He doesn't have what it takes," my father said. "You do. I'm making it official tomorrow. The company will be yours." My blood turned to fire. Every sacrifice, every hour spent proving myself, every wound taken for that family, erased in one sentence. And then Daniel laughed. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll take care of him. He won't be a problem." The words sliced deeper than any blade. I pressed my hand against the railing, knuckles white, fighting the urge to storm in and tear everything apart. But something held me back. A voice, quiet but steady, whispering that revenge isn't taken in heat. It is forged in patience. I drove home that night, with a storm raging inside me. The road blurred through the wetness in my eyes. I kept hearing Daniel's voice, that smug confidence, the promise to take care of me. He thought I was already beaten. He thought he had won. But betrayal is not an ending. It is a beginning. The next morning, the call came. My mother's voice trembled. "Ethan, your father signed over the company. Everything is in Daniel's name now. He said you'll get a settlement, but you're no longer involved." I couldn't even respond. The phone felt heavy against my ear, the silence between us filled with the sound of something inside me dying. The settlement check arrived days later, cold and clinical, the price tag of my loyalty. I tore it in half without even looking at the amount. They wanted to buy my silence, bury me with scraps on the table. Weeks passed. Friends stopped calling. Men I had worked alongside crossed the street to avoid me. My name was no longer respected. It was pitted. Daniel spread his version of the story, that I had been irresponsible, unfit, a liability. He painted himself as the savior of Miller Construction, and people believed him. But I was watching, waiting, learning. One night, I found myself driving past a company yard. The floodlights glared down on the machines I had once commanded. Trucks, bulldozers, cranes, all wearing the Miller name like a crown I had built but could no longer touch. I parked across the street, my breath fogging the windshield, and I whisper a promise into the dark. I'll take it back, every piece of it, and I'll make you choke on what you stole. That promise became my religion. I started small, digging into Daniel's deals, the contractors he used, the bribes he paid to secure city permits. He wasn't careful. He thought he was untouchable now. But corruption leaves fingerprints, and I knew where to look. Each discovery was a spark, fueling the fire in my chest. I wasn't just going to reclaim what was mine. I was going to burn his empire down to ash and watch him crawl through it. But revenge is never a straight path. It twists, it lures, it tempts. And one night, as I was piecing together my brother's secrets, I uncovered something that made my blood freeze. My father had known everything. Every bribe, every underhanded deal, every betrayal of our company's values. He hadn't just allowed it. He had taught Daniel how to do it. The betrayal wasn't just from my brother. It was from the man I had spent my life trying to please. I sat in the dark, paper spread out before me. My heart pounded with rage so pure it made me shake. They had both destroyed me, and now neither of them was safe. The phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number lit the screen. It was a photo. Daniel, sitting at a bar with a glass in his hand, laughing. Below it, a single sentence. He's not as careful as he thinks. Do you want him? I stared at the message, my chest tightening, the room spinning. Someone out there wanted to help me. Or maybe they wanted something else. Either way, the door had opened, and I was ready to walk through it. I almost deleted the message. That might have been the safer thing to do. Delete, forget, let the wound scar over and pretend the infection never spread. But the photograph burned into my phone like an ember, and the single line beneath it was a knife that knew my name. He is not as careful as he thinks. Do you want him? The sender was a ghost. No name, no number I recognized, just a string of digits that could belong to anyone or to no one at all. I stared at the screen until the battery icon blinked low and the room swam around me. Outside, the night had thickened into a silence that felt like conspirator. Inside, I had a choice. I could fold, or I could step into whatever door had opened and see where the hall led. I chose the hall. I replied with one word. Tell me. Minutes later, the phone lit up again. Meet me at the old mill off Route 17 in 30 minutes. Bring nothing. Come alone. 40 minutes later, I parked my car in the shadow of broken windows and a sign that sagged like a tired sentinel. The mill was a place kids dared each other to explore, and where drunks came to sleep off bad decisions. No lights, no cameras, the kind of place where secrets want to be swallowed. I should have felt foolish. Instead, my heart beat like a second engine under my ribs. He was already there, leaning against a rusted beam, coat pulled tight against the evening chill. He was younger than I expected, with a face that fit too easily into a crowd. He had the look of a man who could pass as anyone when he needed to. He flicked his cigarette into the darkness when I approached. "You Ethan Miller?" he asked. The voice was careful, as if each word might be used against him. "That depends on who wants to know," I said. I did not like the tremor in my own voice. "My name is Jonah," he said. "I used to work for Daniel." The world narrowed into a tunnel. Daniel's men had a habit of thinking themselves incorruptible until they became collateral. Jonah's spill of identity felt like the first ripple on a pond that would drown Daniel. "How do I know this isn't set up?" I asked. Jonah smiled, small and hopeless. "You don't. but I have something that proves I'm not lying. He reached into his coat and handed me a thin envelope. Inside were photographs, contracts, small, precise things that fit together like pieces of a puzzle. There were receipts for cash payments, blurred photographs of Daniel with a city inspector, a ledger with numbers rewritten in a hand I recognized because I had seen it on so many invoices we had once trusted. "This is only the tip," Jonah said. "Daniel is laundering contracts through shell companies. He bribes inspectors. He pushes projects through with fake liability insurance. He thought you were out of the way. He thought he had bought everyone. And you?" I asked, "Why come to me?" Jonah flicked a cigarette ash. "Because he double-crossed me. He promised me a share on a municipal job and then folded me out. They always think the people they use are disposable. I want out. I want exposed. I want him to stop breathing down my neck." "So you want revenge?" I asked. I did not want to be reduced to his mirror. "No," he said. "I want to survive. But if you want to make him choke on what he stole, I can help." For a long moment, I simply listened to the sound of my own breath. Outside the mill, a train sighed by, indifferent. Inside, I held the evidence of my brother's betrayal and felt again that old ache. My father had signed away everything. Daniel had sharpened his smile on the bones of the family business. Jonah was a loose thread. If I pulled it, who would unravel? I should have walked away then. I did not. I wanted to see my brother fall. I wanted my father to watch it happen and understand that his choice had been a choice to live with us burning. We made a plan, delicate as a scalpel. Jonah would continue to feed me names and receipts. I would find ways to blow small holes in Daniel's operations, enough to strain his credibility, but not yet to reveal everything. A slow bleed is the cruelest kind. He would go after contract that had the city watching, projects where oversight existed. If Daniel panicked, he would make mistakes, and I would be there to catch them. The first strike was petty, but necessary. A supplier Daniel used to secure bulk materials had a soft spot for quick cash. A late-night call to a foreman, a hint that the deal for hauling aggregate had been loosened, and the suppliers started demanding assurances Daniel could not provide if the city ever audited the job. Rumors are viruses. They infect tender reputations quickly. Daniel snapped and made a phone call so hot with anger it might have lit the air. I smiled in the dark the way one smiles at a thing finally bending to the pressure you applied. But revenge requires more than clever ploys. It demands sacrifices, and the first came sooner than I expected. My mother phoned me after the supplier had backed out. Her voice was thin, frayed. "Ethan, are you seeing the papers? Daniel says you are sabotaging him. People are talking." I felt a flare of guilt so sharp, it almost overwhelmed the thrill. The town is small and barbed. Daniel had made sure everyone heard his story first. He had money to print versions of the truth and to whisper into ears. The community that had once been ours had become his stage, and my mistakes were the play he wrote. I went to see my mother, because she was the only person who cut through the noise. She opened the door in a robe, hair pulled back. The small jewelry she wore looked like cheap armor. Her face was a map of worry. She reached for me without asking why I was there, because reasons do not matter where a mother's heart is concerned. "Are you doing this?" she asked, voice breaking. I did not answer her. How could I tell her that I had a confession and a strategy and a ledger? How could I tell her that the man she had loved and who had loved us had taught our son how to cheat and move quietly around the law? Her eyes searched mine like a compass looking for north. "No, Mama," I said at last. "I would never hurt the family." She nodded as if I had given her something to hold, but the edges of her mouth trembled. I left before I could see whether the tremble was relief or another betrayal. That same afternoon a man from the bank arrived. He was thin with a tie too tight, and he carried the look of someone who knew currency better than people. He said words that settled on my chest like a lead slab. There was a lien on my personal accounts. A creditor had come calling. I had expected financial pain. I had not expected that Daniel, with his new access, had already started strangling the lifelines that once belonged to me. He had built a net to catch me when I fell. You learn about the small cruelties in revenge. Daniel began to file lawsuits that were as much about humiliation as money. He whispered to contractors that doing business with me was to invite trouble. He used the company phone list to smear my name with skill that made my skin crawl. But for every shove he pushed, I had a counter. Jonah introduced me to a city clerk who had a soft spot for truth and a grudge against the inspector Daniel had bought. The clerk gave me the inspector's sign schedules, the times he was at job sites that did not match the logs. It was small, bureaucratic, the kind of thing that seldom moves mountains, but it was a lever, and I learned the old maxim that a lever in the right place can topple statues. One night, standing on the roof of a warehouse, watching the lights of the town like a constellation of possibility, Jonah turned to me and said, "You could never have done this without me." I smiled then, because there was a bitter honesty in it. "Maybe," I said, "but you will not get what you want just by selling me his secrets." "My sister needs a place to live," Jonah said, his face in shadow. "If I get nothing out of this, she is out on the street." I felt that old electric twist in my gut. People think revenge is a solitary sport, and sometimes it is. Other times it is a messy marketplace where people trade favors for relief. Jonah was not a saint. He was a man with skin open from the cold. I could use him. He could use me. That was the ugly calculus. We pushed forward, taking small victories and turning them into leverage. A denied permit here, an inspector's taped testimony there. Daniel began to sweat, his smiles getting thinner. He called my father more often, his voice honeyed and urgent. My father's half-smile in those calls was worse than any scream. And then I found a photograph that I had not expected. While going through a set of scanned emails Jonah had passed me, I saw a picture tucked between lines of text. It was from a company Christmas party the previous winter. The angle was wrong, like an accidental capture, and yet it revealed a moment I had been blind because I trusted the image I had of my family. In the photo, my father and Daniel stood close. Too close, their shoulders touching in a way that looked intimate. My mother was elsewhere in the frame, smiling at someone else. The photograph did not say anything overtly damning, but it told a story about loyalty, about conspiracies where they mattered most. The secret had been closer than I had thought. The discovery did something inside me I could not name. It made my father not just a distant betrayer, but a conspirator with his own son. The hands that had steadied me were the same hands that had signed my exile. To think of them together in shared design was to realize that love had been traded for power. I had a new plan, and one that cut deeper. I would not simply collapse Daniel's schemes. I would force my father to see what he had made. I would pull threads until he could not ignore the pattern of his choices. I would make the house of Miller tremble. The night I decided to act, I drove back to the house where it had all started. The porch light burned low like a solemn eye. I stood at the edge of the yard and watched my brother's truck in the driveway. Inside, laughter leaked to the windows like smoke. My mother's voice floated out in conversation, warm, unaware. I felt the old, sweet ache of home and then a coldness, so precise it almost felt surgical. I sat in my car and opened the envelope again, fingering the photographs as if they might rearrange into something kinder. My phone buzzed. A number I did not recognize flashed across the screen. I answered it because the night had been swallowed up in a hunger I could not quell. A voice, paper-thin but urgent, said, "They are watching more closely than you think. Be careful, Ethan." There was a click, and then the dial tone hummed like a dare. My palm slicked on the steering wheel. Watching closely. I pictured cameras, informants. The town turned into a net. I started the engine, the car idling like a living thing, and in my head the plan went through another iteration. Expose Daniel enough to wobble him, force my father to choose a side, make the family fall apart, and then set on fire. Justice was no longer an abstract. It was a meal I wanted to eat cold and deliberate. I reached the porch, and the door stood slightly ajar. The house seemed to breathe, each breath a secret. I stepped inside because I had to see whether my mother's heart still beat with the same rhythm as the woman who had kissed my cheek that first night when I walked through the door and found my future already sold. The hallway smelled like lavender and lemon, an attempt at erasing fear. On the dining table a stack of mail waited. On top was a small envelope with my name written in my father's slanted handwriting. My throat closed. I opened it with hands that did not want to tremble. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a key. The paper was brief. Ethan, come by the office tomorrow. We need to talk. Dad. My vision tunneled. The key was heavy and cold. The office. Why would he summon me to the place where he had signed the things that unraveled my life? Why now? Had something shifted in him? Or was this another trap? Another way to draw me in and watch my collapse with connoisseur's delight? I stood there with a key in my palm and 1,000 possible futures spinning in my head. If I went to the office, I could confront him, demand answers, force a confession. If I stayed away, I would be accused of cowardice. If I walked in, my brother's men would be there, or worse, the law in a form that preferred spectacle to truth. I slipped the key into my pocket and felt its weight like a verdict. Outside the house the night had thinned into something like morning. Far off, a dog barked and then fell silent. The mill where I had met Jonah crouched in the distance like an ally ready to move. My phone vibrated in my hand, and a new message lit the screen. This time a short clip. It showed the front of the Miller office, cameras panning across the facade, and then the image snapped to a close-up of the company plaque. Over the plaque someone had spray, painted a single word, betrayer. My chest tightened until I could no longer breathe easily. Someone was escalating. Someone knew how to push the town's nerves. Someone was daring me to step into the light and see exactly who would burn. I looked at the house, at my mother asleep in a chair by the lamp, at the keys in my pocket, and I understood that whatever came next would not be simple revenge. It would be a reckoning where family and fury collided, where the truth would not only be revealed, it would demand a price. I drove away before the dawn could find me at the doorstep. I had a meeting with my father. I had a war to start. I had to decide whether to walk into his office tomorrow empty-handed or carrying a ledger that would rip him from the pedestal he had placed himself upon. As the road unrolled before me, the town behind me still asleep, I felt the first true tremor of fear, not for myself, but for what the truth would do to the mother who loved both of them. I wanted to be the man who saved her. I also wanted to be the man who made Daniel suffer. The phone buzzed once more. A single line of text, simple as a guillotine. They are watching the office too. Be careful of who you trust. I slammed my hand on the steering wheel. The sound of shout that had nowhere to go. The game had become bigger than I thought. The players multiplied. The stakes were personal in a way that made my stomach twist. I started the car and drove into whatever light was waiting. The key in my pocket was the difference between a meeting and a trap. The ledger I hoped to build was a promise. The photographs were kindling. And somewhere out there someone was deciding whether to help me or to push me off the cliff they had built with their lies. Tonight, I would sleep with my shoes on. Tomorrow I would meet my father. And when I did, the floor would tilt under us both. If you've been following this from the start and you want to see the truth carved out, like, comment, share. It matters. It keeps the story honest. It keeps me honest. The key in my pocket felt heavier than metal as I walked up the steps to the Miller construction office. The sun was a thin thing behind clouds, as if the day itself wanted to keep its distance from what was about to happen. My hands were steady because a life tempered by waiting will teach you how to control the tremors. My heart, however, refused to be disciplined. It kept a stubborn tempo against my ribs, a drumbeat I could not quiet. The front door opened before I could reach the knob. My father stood in the lobby, coatless, as though the small act of leaving the jacket behind was an offering of openness. He was thinner than the last time I had seen him in the house. The lines on his face had become sharper, as if the stress of his choices had carved new canyons. His eyes widened when he saw me. For a moment there was something that looked like regret. Then he folded it away like a newspaper. "Ethan," he said. The name sounded like a small stone dropped into a deep pool. "Dad," I said. The office smelled of lemon cleaner and dust. "You wanted to talk." He nodded. We sat at his desk, because that is where the smallest of people seem the biggest. He steepled his fingers and watched me, as if cataloging my flaws. I wanted to hurl the ledger at him, to show him the receipts, the photographs, the way he had traded his son for a promise of power. Instead, I opened my mouth and waited because sometimes the slow reveal is the cruelest blade. "Why?" I asked finally. It was not a word aimed for information as much as for admission. He inhaled, and I could see him choose his words like someone picking loose stones from a wall. Your mother is sick, he said. My stomach dropped. That was not testimony to complicity. That was an attempt at an excuse. He watched my face carefully, as a man watches a ledger balance. What does that have to do with signing away our company? I asked. The rage inside me had been sharpened by months of cleanliness and 1,000 small betrayals. I wanted this to be simple, but it kept getting knotted. He swallowed. There were bills, Ethan, medical bills, insurance gaps. I thought I could fix it on my own. I thought Daniel could help. I thought we were making the right choice to get the money in, to keep the business running, and to hide the worst of it until we could make it right. You thought, I repeated. The paper between us smelled like old promises. So you gambled away what we built because you were afraid. He flinched like a man struck. I was afraid, he said. I did what any father would do when he thinks his family will fall apart. I signed because I wanted to guarantee that the company could keep us. I signed because I loved you the only way I knew how, which is to try and fix things and fail. You loved us by betraying us, I said. The words came out raw, not polished. They did not land like accusation. They landed like truth. I made a mistake, he said. A terrible one. There was a pause, a sliver of time where the two of us existed only as breath and the tick of the clock on his shelf. I had rehearsed shouting, pleading, throwing the photographs into his face, but none of that felt right. Confrontation is not always a shout. Sometimes it is a stillness where the damage is allowed to register. You taught him, I said then, the accusation like a flare. You taught Daniel how to bend the rules. You didn't stop him. You helped him. His face changed. For the first time in a long, while there was a flicker of shame, so sharp it made him small. I was weak, he said. I was scared and I made choices I regret. I never wanted to see you hurt. You hurt me more than you can imagine, I said. I kept this company afloat. I put my life into it. And you signed it away like a bill at a deli. He looked at me then with an intensity that was part plea and part accusation. We had threats, Ethan, not from Daniel, from someone with power, someone who could ruin us. I thought giving Daniel control with his connections would buy us protection. The room tilted. Someone with power. This was no longer a small family quarrel. This was a design. I pressed forward because that was all I had. Who? He hesitated. For a moment I thought he would lie. Instead he reached into the drawer, took out a small envelope, and slid across the desk. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar. Inside was a single card, embossed with the name Caldwell and a state seal. Mayor Caldwell. He threatened to pull every permit for any municipal work if we did not cooperate. My father said. He said he could make sure no business associated with Miller Construction would ever get a city contract again. He said he could destroy us. Daniel made a deal because he thought it would save what we had left. The betrayal spread across me like frost. A mayor with hands in the ledger. Friends who wore suits and shook hands like saints while they stamped out families. This explained some things, but it did not excuse the way my father had folded like a card player who had lost his nerve. You could have come to me, I said. We could have fought him together. I was ashamed, he said. I am ashamed. I thought I could fix it without dragging you into the mire. The confession lodged in my chest like an unwanted name. It opened a new corridor of rage and sorrow. The man I had devoted my life to was not a villain of cartoonish proportions. He was a frightened man whose fear had multiplied into betrayal. The discovery did not make the wounds hurt less. If anything, it made them more complicated. You want me to help? My father said suddenly. His voice changed. There was a desperation that stitched itself into his words. I think Mayor Caldwell is going to extend his reach. He is going after Daniel now because he wants to control the whole company. I thought if Daniel ran the company, he could keep us safe. I was wrong. Before I could respond, the door burst open. Daniel stood there, a storm of anger and control. He had the look of a man who had rehearsed fury in a mirror. He did not come in alone. Two men I recognized as his new foreman stood behind him, shoulders like bookends. "You traitor," he said, and the word had teeth. He strode to the desk and slammed a file down. "You come here with your pretty speeches about threats and city men, and you expect me to believe you? You just want to carve up what I built." My father rose slowly, his hand lifting in a helpless gesture. "Danny, listen, we need to... You think you can lecture me about morals?" Daniel said. His face was close to mine now, nostrils flaring. "You think you can lecture me about anything? You are weak. You always have been. You sold your son because you were afraid. And now you come here, pretending to be repentant? You did not get to look me in the eye." The men behind him shifted like wolves finding scent. The room had turned hot. My father's voice trembled as he tried to explain. I watched my brother move like a man who had swallowed a lie and let it lodge in his throat until rage made it a weapon. "You are under investigation," I said, because until the moment the only shield I had was truth. "I have documents. I have receipts. I have witnesses." Daniel laughed then, a sound that had lost the warmth of humor and become a machine. "You think you can bring me down with scribbles and whispers? You are pathetic if you do." The foreman stepped forward, one of them blocking the exit. The movement was not subtle. It was a cordon. Daniel's eyes darted to my father, then back at me, and a new expression settled on his face. Calculation, the cold sort that does not flinch when someone else bleeds. "You need to leave," he said to me. "You need to walk out and never come back, or you make yourself a spectacle." I did not move. The ledger was in my head like a map. The photographs were punctures in his armor. I imagined Jonah watching from the mill, or the clerk with the inspector's logs, waiting for me to make the right choice. I imagined my mother at home, unaware that her family was about to rip itself open. "You would threaten me in my own office," my father said. The plea in his voice was raw enough to make me think of the nights he had sat with me when I could not sleep. For a moment, he was not the man who had sold our life. He was just a man. Daniel's hand drifted to his coat, as if searching for a paper he might throw at me. Instead, he leaned down and whispered something to one of his men. The man smiled in a way that made my scalp prickle. He reached into his pocket, and for a second my mind threw up every possible threat. But the object he pulled out was not a gun. It was a phone. He showed it to Daniel, and Daniel's smile turned into something I had not expected. "You have a nice way of showing up, Ethan," he said. "Too bad everything cameras have seen tonight will be the story the town believes." My head spun. My first thought was the security cameras around the office. My second thought was a car in the driveway. My third thought was that someone had been very careful to record this moment. Daniel had always been good at records. He understood narratives better than any of us. He was not just a liar. He was a choreographer of truth. One of his men hit a button on the phone. A video began to play on the screen. The feed showed the front of the building, then cut to my father's desk. The angle shifted, and the image froze on me standing in the doorway, and then it showed something else. It showed a hand flinging a piece of paper across the desk. It was a mice and scene designed to make me look like a troublemaker, an intruder. My throat closed. I had not given them the ledger. I had brought nothing with me. How could they make it look like I was the one trying to plant evidence? Before I could gather the words, the hallway door slammed again, and the office filled with uniformed officers. Their faces were blank, efficient, a public performance of law. At the front, a woman I recognized from town hall stood with a badge I did not need to see to understand. Mayor Caldwell's influence was never subtle. It preferred spectacle. "Ethan Miller," one of the officers said, and his voice was flat as a slab of concrete. "You are under investigation for tamper with company documents and attempting to sabotage municipal contracts." The accusation landed on me like a punch. My father's eyes widened with a new horror, as if he had not known how far the consequences would spiral. Daniel's smile was slow and triumphant. He looked at me as if this were a curtain falling on a well-rehearsed scene. I opened my mouth to protest. It seemed obscene to deny a lie in the face of men with badges and a phone that told their story. I was not prepared for the thing that happened next. A shot rang out. The sound was like a meteor strike in a small room. My father slumped forward against his desk, blood blooming like a dark flower on the wood. For a second, the air itself forgot how to move. Daniel's face went white. The officers swore. People shouted. My hands found my father's shoulders because some reflex that had nothing to do with reason was stronger than fear. He looked at me with eyes that had been tired for too long, and then closed them. The room fell into a noise that had lost its center. As I knelt beside him, someone's hand grabbed my lapel and hauled me to my feet. Daniel barked something indistinct, a sound of triumph and calculation braided together. The camera feed was still rolling. The officers were stunned. The mayor's people were pleased, and the town's narrative was being written in real time. A voice behind me said, loud and final, "You did this." I turned. The accusation was not a question. It was a verdict before the trial had even started. The security camera angled down at me, as if the lens itself were a judge. They had framed me in the single most brutal way possible. They had given the town a story where I was the villain, and my father the victim of my supposed treachery. I looked at my father's face, blood feathering his shirt, his breath leaving him in ragged pulls. I looked at Daniel's expression, equal parts grief and hunger. I looked at the officers and the mayor's allies and at the camera that had recorded everything they needed the town to see. And in that instant, I understood that the war had escalated far beyond contracts and ledgers. It had become a battle for the only thing that still mattered to me, the truth about who my family had become. I did not know then whether Dad would live. I did not know whether I would be hauled away in irons or whether someone would step forward and blow open the story Daniel had crafted. What I did know was that the moment had been engineered to break me, and that breaking was exactly what they intended. The hand on my arm tightened until it hurt. Daniel's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "You did this," he said again. "We saw you. The cameras saw you. There is no place for your lies anymore." I had one beat, one moment between breath and the drop of the gavel. I had to decide whether to fight with the truth or to die trying. I looked at my father, whose chest rose and fell with a life that swayed like a boat. I looked at Jonah's face in my memory, at the mill, at the clerk who had signed schedules. I thought of my mother asleep at home, unaware her life had just been detonated. The accusation hung in front of me like a noose. Outside, through the office windows, City Hall stood like a colossus, and I understood that the strings that bound us were longer and stronger than any of us had imagined. The officer led me out into the sunlight, and the town watched in a silence that smelled of milk and fear. The cameras blinked, faithful and cold. Everything had just become infinitely more dangerous. Blood as a smell. I never knew that until I saw it on Daniel's hands. It was faint, metallic, mixed with the cheap cologne he wore, but it clung to him like guilt. That night in the bar's back alley, when I cornered him with the evidence of his corruption, I noticed it. He brushed past me, muttering excuses, and I caught the faint stains on his cuff. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a fight, maybe a scrape, but deep down I knew it meant more. When I went home, I couldn't sleep. The documents lay across my kitchen table like a jigsaw puzzle of treachery. My father's signature on fake contracts. Daniel's text arranging bribes. A pattern of betrayal carved into ink and paper. And yet, my mind kept drifting back to that blood. Whose was it? I was circling the drain of paranoia, but then the phone buzzed. The same unknown number that had sent me Daniel's photo weeks ago. This time, it wasn't a picture. It was a single line of text. "Your father has more to lose than you realize. Meet me tomorrow, 9 p.m. train yard." My stomach knotted. I had avoided this shadowy hand tugging at my life, but the time for hesitation was over. If I wanted revenge, I had to step into the fire. The next night, the train yard was deserted. Freight cars lined up like sleeping beasts. The air reeked of oil and rust. I stood under a flickering light, my breath fogging in the September chill. For 10 minutes, nothing, then footsteps echoed. A figure emerged from between the cars. A woman, mid-30s, sharp suit under a trench coat, eyes that looked like they hadn't closed in weeks. She didn't introduce herself. She just handed me a folder. "Your brother isn't just dirty. He's dangerous." I opened it. Inside were photos of Daniel meeting with men I didn't recognize. Not businessmen, not contractors. These men had the look of wolves, cold, hungry, lethal. Who are they? I asked. She lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating her face. Cartel connections. He's been laundering money through Miller Construction. Your father knew. He signed off on it. That's why the city keeps giving your brother contracts. They're all getting a cut. My throat closed. I had suspected corruption, but this was rot that reached deeper than I ever imagined. And who the hell are you? I demanded. She exhaled smoke. Someone who lost more to your family's business than you ever did. My brother worked for Miller Construction. He tried to expose what Daniel was doing. He disappeared. They said it was an accident at the site. I never believed it. And now I know I was right. The blood on Daniel's cuff flashed in my mind. My gut twisted. What do you want from me? I asked. Her eyes met mine. Same thing you want. To see them fall. I have information. You have access. Together, we can destroy them. For a long moment, I just stared at her, the weight of choice crushing me. She could be lying. She could be using me. But the fire inside me, the hunger for vengeance, whispered that this was a path. I nodded. Then let's burn them. From that night, we became partners in silence. Her name was Claire. She fed me files, contacts, whispers from the underbelly of the city. I fed her my knowledge of how Daniel thought, how my father moved his pieces. We struck like shadows, leaking documents to the press, planting seeds of doubt in the investors' ears. And it worked. Slowly, Miller Construction began to crack. A deal fell through here, an audit started there. Daniel grew frantic, his perfect smile slipping in boardrooms. My father drank more heavily, his hands trembling when he lifted the glass. But then came the call. It was my mother. Her voice was thin, broken. Ethan, you need to come. Your father, he collapsed. I froze. By the time I reached the hospital, he was pale and weak, wires tethered to his chest. The bourbon had eaten him alive. Daniel was there too, sitting by the bed, his eyes red. For a moment, I saw the boy I used to protect, the brother I once loved. Our father's eyes opened, bloodshot but sharp. He looked at me, then at Daniel. You, both of you, must keep the company alive. I almost laughed. Even on his deathbed, he clung to that empire of lies. But I didn't laugh. I leaned in close and whispered, It's already dying, and I'll be the one to bury it. His eyes widened, then closed. A weak smile curved his lips. Minutes later, the machine screamed, and just like that, the man I had spent my life chasing approval from was gone. The funeral was a storm. Rain hammered the earth as we stood at the graveside. My mother clutched my arm, her sobs muffled against my jacket. Daniel stood opposite me, soaked but defiant, his jaw tight, his eyes burning into mine. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The war between us had just become blood feud. After the burial, he cornered me. The rain dripped from his hair, his fists clenched. You think you're clever, he hissed. Leaking files, turning people against me. I know it's you. But listen carefully, brother. If you keep pushing, I'll bury you like Dad. For a second, I thought he might strike me right there among the tombstones. But he didn't. He just turned and walked away, leaving me in the rain, shivering not from the cold but from the truth. Claire was right. He wasn't just corrupt. He was dangerous. And now, with our father gone, he was free to unleash hell. That night, I returned to my apartment to find the door ajar. My chest tightened. Slowly, I pushed it open. Inside, everything was still, too still. Then I saw it. On my kitchen table, where I had once spread out evidence, now lay a single object, a photo frame. Inside was a picture of my mother, smiling, and across the glass, smeared in red, was one word. Next, my knees nearly gave out. The blood wasn't old. It was fresh. I grabbed the frame, my hands shaking, my mind spiraling. This wasn't just about business anymore. Daniel had declared war on blood. I called Claire immediately. She answered on the first ring. They threatened her. I said, my voice breaking. She was silent for a moment, then spoke with steel. Then we stopped playing games. We take everything. We bring him down completely. But if he touches her, he won't if we move first. I looked at the photo at my mother's gentle face, now marked by violence, and I made my choice. Then we move. I said, I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, the storm outside rattling the windows, my mind replaying every moment, every betrayal, every chance I had to stop this sooner. But regret is useless. Only revenge remained. By morning, I had a plan that would not just destroy Daniel's empire, but expose him to the wolves he had invited into our lives. Claire and I would light the fuse, and Daniel would burn. But as I prepared to strike, a thought haunted me. What if the person I was becoming, the man fueled by rage and vengeance, was no different from the brother I sought to destroy? The thought lingered, but then the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Claire. It wasn't Daniel. It was my mother, and her voice was barely a whisper. Ethan, help me. He's here. They told me the truth would set me free. What they did not tell me was how heavy the truth would be when I finally lifted it into daylight. If you ever felt the urge to stay, to see how this ends, comment, share the story. It matters. It makes the next breath worth taking. Claire drove like a woman who had spent a lifetime outrunning ghosts. Her car cut through the pre-dawn fog like a blade. She had a hard set to her jaw, the kind that meant she had rehearsed regret and decided anger was the better weapon. Beside me sat a man I had only met twice and trusted only because we had no other options. His name was Marcus, and he worked investigations for a federal unit that smelled trouble and fed on corruption. He wore civics like a second skin, quiet and unyielding. We were heading to the hearing at City Hall, where Caldwell, the mayor, was scheduled to answer questions about permit irregularities and municipal favors. The front page of the paper had already run an anonymous scoop showing ledgers linking Caldwell to offshore accounts. Daniel had been rattled and clumsy since then, his men making mistakes that left fingerprints that could be followed with a hot light. Tonight had to be the night we finished this properly. No leaks, no half measures. My mother insisted on coming. I did not want her there. I did not want her to see the ugliness of what we were about to reveal. But she had a stubbornness that had nothing to do with naivety and everything to do with love. She put a hand on my cheek and looked at me like she had every right to judge me and every reason to forgive me. Be careful, she said. Be my son. The hearing room smelled like old oak and fresh dread. It was packed beyond capacity with people who came to watch the spectacle of the powerful being exposed. Cameras hung from corners like vultures. The mayor sat under a glass of lights, pale and slick with a smile that had been practiced into his face over too many years. Daniel was there too, a half step behind his lawyer, sweat making connections between the hair at his temples. Marcus stood when it was his moment and spoke with a steady, legal tremor. He laid out a web of transactions, shell companies, and signed affidavits from inspectors who had been paid to look away. Claire produced photographs that showed Daniel meeting men whose names were laced with violence. Someone from the prosecutor's office had been listening and asking notes with a pencil as if they were taking inventory. When I stood to speak, the weight of every hour I had sacrificed tensed in my chest. I had rehearsed the lines I would say, the way I would place the ledger on the table, and watch my brother's face fall. What I had not rehearsed was the way my hands would want to shake when I finally said the names that had haunted me. I told the room about the bribes, the falsified insurance, the city inspector who had gone silent after a mysterious accident on site. I told him about Jonah and the men who had disappeared, and the ledger with the mayor's name stamped across it in more than ink. I placed photographs on the table and watched as the prosecutor's eyes flicked as the room held its breath like a body waiting for a verdict. Daniel's lawyer objected. Caldwell called for order. People shouted. Then Daniel stood. He looked small up on his feet, like a man whose mask had been removed and left him raw. He accused me of fabrications. He accused Claire of being a liar. He accused the prosecutor of partisan theater. He leaned close to the microphone and, in a voice that was all practiced outrage, accused me of the same crimes that had been thrust at him for months. For half a second, the room trembled. The cameras swung to me and then back to him like a pair of geese deciding who would sing. And then Marcus did something I had not expected. He slid a folder across the table to the prosecutor. Inside were voice recordings, phone transfers, and bank logs the mayor could not deny. Caldwell's face went an even paler shade of beige. He knew the language of cover-ups well, but not the language of men who had been patient enough to collect everything that mattered. The prosecutor read a line out loud, and the mayor's smile cracked like a shell. You could feel the air change. It was as if the room had been waiting for permission to breathe. Then Daniel did something even more dangerous. He slammed his hand on the table and pointed at my mother who sat in the gallery. He accused her of being complicit, of knowing about the money, of benefiting from the schemes. He narrowed his eyes until they were knife slits. "Your mother?" I said, disbelief and fury curdling into something else. "You want to drag her into this too?" He smiled. It was a small, cruel thing. "Whatever it takes to make him look guilty," he said. The gallery erupted. My mother's face went white. She had never been anything other than steady in her kindness, and suddenly that kindness was used like a prop in his script. I stood and crossed the room to where she sat. I grabbed her hand so tight my knuckles screamed. "They cannot touch you," I said, but my voice sounded thin beside the clatter. That was when the lights in the room fizzed and the cameras blinked. Someone shouted. The doors at the back slammed. The sound of boots on marble traveled like a heartbeat. Men in dark coats appeared, not police but hired security, and they moved with a precision that spoke an organized muscle. Daniel's smile broadened until it was obscene. "Plan B," he muttered, and a man in a suit produced a small device that, before anyone could react, sent a pulse through the room. Phones died, cameras cut to static, and the lights went out in one synchronous breath. The gallery plunged into a dark that was thick with the scent of fear. I felt a hand at my collar and a boot at my ankle. A voice snarled in my ear, "Stay down." Someone near the back screamed, a sound that tore the edges of sound itself. My mother's hand had been wrenched from mine. I could hear shuffling commands and clip tones. The hearing room had become a stage for a show I had not auditioned for. I twisted, saw the silhouette of a man with a gun, and then a flash. The taste of ozone filled my mouth. I heard my mother cry out. In the dark, my world narrowed to a pinpoint of sound. It was either a trap or the catastrophe I had been trying to avoid since the photo was smeared with blood. When the lights came back, the room was a theater of frozen faces. A man lay on the floor by the mayor's podium bleeding, his suit blooming like a dark sunset. Daniel was on his knees, hands up, but his eyes were furious with something that was not grief. Someone had tried to take Mayor Caldwell, and in the scramble, a body had been struck down. The local police swarmed the place, cuffing, yelling, pushing bodies into corners. The hired security melted into the chaos like smoke. I looked down at my mother and felt the worst twist of fate take me by the throat. She was on the floor, eyes wide and wet, but alive. A bullet had grazed her shoulder, and the blood on her blouse was bright and warm. She looked at me, and in that look was something that made my bones unsteady. Not fear, not yet, recognition. She mouthed, "Ethan, save them." They grabbed me before I could move. Agents from Marcus's unit shoved badges and faces and forced me toward a wall. I was neither handcuffed nor free. The prosecutor whispered urgently into a phone and told the officers to hold off. The cameras had returned, the feeds alive with the image of a town tearing at itself. Daniel tried to stand to speak, but his lawyers suffocated his voice with platitudes. Men in plain clothes handcuffed him gently and read him his rights. He looked at me one last time, and the look was not of a brother, but of a man who had been caught in a lie big enough to drown in. Outside, the town news vans honked, and people shouted into microphones. The mayor was carried out on a stretcher, vowing revenge like a prayer. The body on the floor at the podium was covered with a sheet as officers sealed the room. Claire found me in the press swirl, her face cut and bleeding from smoke from whatever device had been set off. She held my mother's hand and did not look away. Marcus came to my side and placed a palm on my shoulder with a strength that steadied me. "This will not be easy," he said, "but the evidence is solid. We can move fast now. We can get you cleared. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to break open and pour out every hurt until there was no more left to argue with. Instead, I thought about the ledger, about the men who had disappeared, about Jonah, and the clerk who had kept his mouth shut until now. I thought about the sound my father made when he died, like a man whose chest had been made empty by his own choices. I thought about the way Daniel had smiled like a man who believed himself invincible. As they led me through the crowd, I felt the pressed breath like a tide. Questions were thrown at me like stones. Was I guilty? Was I a liar? Had I done this to take revenge? The camera lights were hot and unblinking. The story would be written tonight, and people would choose their sides like predators choose fresh meat. Before they pushed me into the van, I turned and looked back. The room where we had tried to set the truth free was a mess of paper, blood, and splintered wood. My mother sat on a bench, Claire at her side, and the prosecutor leaning over the covered body, as if trying to find a pulse in the air. Daniel's face was gone from view. Caldwell, the mayor, had been shot and was alive but in critical condition. A man I had seen in photos earlier, a face I now recognized from a security image Marcus had shown me, was being carried out with cuffs on his wrists. A voice from the crowd called out my name, and for a moment I felt the world tilt and the truth looked like a small, bright stone in a river. I clenched my hands until my nails ripped flesh. The van door slammed and the sound swallowed me. As we drove away, sirens wailing, Claire's hand slid into mine to the small window and squeezed. She could not promise me victory. No one could. All she could do was stand in the dark alongside me and keep the light from snuffing out. Across town, under sky that did not yet know whether to weep or sleep, someone watched the rear camera footage and smiled. They had not expected me to fight back with this kind of hunger. They had not expected me to drag the rot into daylight. But the worst part was that even if Daniel fell, and the mayor fell, and the cartel fractures, there would always be another man waiting to pick up what they had dropped. The van rounded a corner, and the city lights streaked by like the closing of an eyelid. For the first time since this began, I allowed myself to feel something close to hope. Then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. One word. And I looked up, and the van slid into a dark tunnel. The lights at the entrance blinked and then went out.